In a market saturated with Souls-like games, only a few have managed to truly stand out and differentiate themselves from the familiar From Software formula. The Nioh series is arguably the best example of a Souls-like that break away and become its own thing. And now we have a third entry with Nioh 3. This installment introduces major changes compared to its predecessors, most notably a shift from a segmented mission-driven structure to a more semi-open and seamless world design. And unfortunately, Team Ninja hasn't done a great job adapting the Katana engine to accommodate this significant transition. But before diving into the technical issues, let's start with some positives. As with most modern games, booting up Nioh 3 for the first time triggers a shader compilation process, which didn't take a long time to finish on the Ryzen 7 5700X 3D and successfully pre-cached all the necessary shaders, as I did not encounter any shader compilation stutter even during intense scenes filled with particles and effects. On the visual side, Nioh 3 does not employ any cutting-edge rendering techniques and instead sticks to more conventional methods. This results in somewhat inconsistent visuals. At times the game can look beautiful, even stunning, but more often than not it falls short, especially when it comes to lighting and global illumination. That said, visuals aren't the main issue here, nor are they the main reason we play these games. The real problem is performance. Despite its relatively modest visuals, aggressive LOD, and low NPC density, Nioh 3 is surprisingly demanding, especially on the CPU side. The main culprit is the Katana engine itself. For a long time now, this engine hasn't scaled well on the CPU, and it can exhibit strange pacing and simulation timing behavior when the game isn't locked to a steady 30, 60, or 120 FPS. To show what I mean, let's take a look at the game with a 60 FPS cap versus a 120 FPS cap. The first thing you'll notice is how the engine starts to overreact and pushes CPU usage significantly higher when enabling the 120 FPS cap, even though the game is still running closer to 60 FPS. The second issue is how the game's pacing and simulation timing become inconsistent when it fails to hold a stable 60 or 120 FPS. This directly affects camera movement, which looks uneven and stuttery with an unlocked frame rate, unlike the much smoother behavior seen with a fixed 60 or 120. Game speed can also be affected. For example, here you can see the player movement slows down when performance isn't locked to 60 FPS. This issue becomes far more noticeable when the game is CPU limited and operating well below the FPS target, as shown here on the Ryzen 5 3600. But that's not all. The game can also exhibit some graphical glitches when running with an unlocked frame rate. For example, notice how artificial light shadows completely disappear when the frame rate is unlocked, only to return when the game is holding a steady 60 or 120. So it's clear that Nioh 3 is designed around maintaining a stable 30, 60, or 120 FPS. Frame generation is also an option to reach the FPS target, like here from 60 to 120, but this comes with its own issues and considerations. For instance, when the GPU is already under heavy load at 60 FPS, frame generation won't be able to consistently lock the output to 120 FPS. In those cases, the latency penalty is also much higher, compared to situations where GPU usage is low and there is enough headroom at 60 FPS. Because after all, frame generation isn't free and it comes with its own computational cost. The second issue is specific to DLSS frame generation. Here you can see how camera motion with DLSS frame gen doesn't look as smooth as it does with FSR frame generation or a native 60 FPS cap. This is because at 120Hz, enabling DLSS frame generation also activates reflex, which caps the frame rate at around 116, resulting in uneven camera motion. A possible workaround is to use DLSS frame generation at refresh rates higher than 120, like 144Hz. But this can introduce another issue. The Katana engine doesn't just expect the frame rate to hit its FPS target to behave correctly, it also expects the frame rate to align with the display's refresh rate. For example, running the game with a 60 FPS cap on a 120Hz display results in frequent frame time spikes and noticeable micro stuttering. Switching the display refresh rate to 60Hz instead produces a much smoother frame time graph and noticeably better pacing. So to conclude, the best way to play Nioh 3 is to stick to an FPS target that your system can reliably maintain. Frame generation can be used to reach 120 FPS or higher as long as there is enough GPU headroom for it to hold that target. And regardless of the FPS target you choose, the most effective way to avoid micro stuttering and uneven frame pacing as much as possible is to match the display refresh rate to that target. And with all those issues out of the way, let's now move on to image quality and the different upscalers. Nioh 3 natively supports DLSS 4 transformer model with preset K alongside FSR 3.1 and XeSS. As expected, DLSS has a clear image quality advantage, especially when it comes to sharpness and motion clarity. FSR 3.1, on the other hand, has a noticeably softer presentation, which helps hide some of the flickering artifacts that are more prominent with XeSS DP4A. But DLSS isn't flawless either. Here we can see the usual pixelation and disocclusion artifacts, especially behind the moving weapon. While it's not as severe as with FSR3, it's still noticeable. This brings us to DLSS 4.5's presets L and M, which significantly reduce these artifacts and deliver a much cleaner results compared to preset K. The improvement is especially noticeable during fast-paced combat and rapid animation transitions. In those scenarios, preset K shows a lot of breakup, while preset L and M maintain a more stable image. However, DLSS 4.5 isn't without its own drawbacks, particularly preset M, which can introduce noticeable noise on foliage compared to preset L and K, as you can see here. So overall, if you are using an RTX 40 or 50 series GPU, DLSS 4.5 preset L is definitely worth trying. Yes, there is the performance cost on the 4070 Super at 1440p with 65% resolution scaling. Preset L performs nearly 10% slower than preset K. Still, the image quality improvement make that trade-off worthwhile. For older RTX cards like the 3060 Ti, DLSS 4.5 is hard to recommend due to the heavy performance penalty. Even when dropping the internal resolution to 55% with DLSS 4.5 compared to 65% on DLSS 4 preset K, there is still a significant performance hit, as you can see here. One last thing to keep in mind is that the game's default sharpness value of 1.0 produces an over-sharpened image even with preset K. Presets L and M can look slightly worse with this sharpness level, and in my opinion, 0.9 is the sweet spot, especially for DLSS 4.5's presets. When it comes to the graphics menu and the user interface, Team Ninja has done a decent job overall, following the same approach as Rise of the Ronin. For instance, there is a handy shortcut button to make the menu transparent or hide it completely, letting you preview visual changes in real time without closing the menu. They've also packed in a ton of tweakable settings, but unfortunately most of them don't work at all or have little to no meaningful impact on performance. I'll start by going through these settings, beginning with model quality. This setting seems to be broken as I couldn't observe any visual differences in the polygonal complexity of models, LOD transitions, or overall draw distances. As you can see here, objects pop in at exactly the same distance regardless of the selected option. Model texture quality, on the other hand, has a noticeable visual impact as it controls the texture resolution of most of the game's geometry along with the mesh quality of some objects. Moving from very low to standard improves texture quality and level of detail on objects close to the camera, while pushing it further to ultra mainly affects the mesh quality of distant objects, as you can see here. Number of models displayed is another setting that doesn't seem to be working. I tested it across multiple scenes with both primary and secondary destructible objects, and there is no visible difference between few and many, as you can see here. Wind sway also doesn't work as intended. Even when set to off, plants, foliage, and clothing continue to sway with no noticeable difference compared to low or standard. Next on the list is motion quality. This setting controls the animation update rate of distant NPCs. Although characters and enemies farther away use a much lower update rate, resulting in noticeably choppy or janky animations. The next setting on this list is background mesh quality. This affects the geometric quality and surface complexity of certain background objects, as you can see here. As a result, both low and standard exhibit noticeable pop-in compared to high. And you might be wondering why I haven't discussed the performance impact of these settings. The reason is simple: they don't have any meaningful impact at all. In theory, most of these options should affect CPU performance. But even when CPU bound on the Ryzen 5 3600, comparing the lowest and highest settings shows no significant performance difference. The only notable difference is increased VRAM usage from model texture quality, which might get even higher in other areas. That's why I recommend leaving all of these settings at their highest values, and if you are using an 8GB GPU, drop model texture quality to standard to avoid potential VRAM issues. The last setting that doesn't function correctly is anisotropic filtering. Switching from off to X16 shows no significant visible difference. Thankfully, the game appears to apply high-quality texture filtering by default regardless of the selected option. Performance-wise, there is no measurable difference between off and X16. And even if this setting were working properly, it wouldn't have much impact on performance. So it's best to leave it set to X16. Now let's move on to the impactful and functional settings, starting with shadow quality. This one primarily affects the resolution of the game's shadow maps. On low and especially very low, shadows look heavily pixelated and blocky with noticeable flickering. Very low also disables local or artificial light shadows, resulting in a much flatter look as you can see here. Performance-wise, there is roughly a 4% hit when moving from very low to standard and around a 10% drop when going further to high and ultra. So for this one, I recommend standard shadows. Next up is Ambient Occlusion. Turning AO off completely results in a very flat look. Very low adds a subtle layer of ambient occlusion, while the options from low to ultra extend the effect across more of the scene. However, these options can sometimes overshade the image, creating a dark halo around many objects. There is also another issue with this game's ambient occlusion. Foliage can start to look noisy from low and above, as you can see here. And because of its low quality, ambient occlusion has a negligible performance impact. So if the noise bothers you, I recommend leaving it set to very low. Otherwise, go for ultra for maximum depth. Moving on to effects, this setting doesn't seem to impact the game's environmental visual effects. Instead, it mainly controls effects generated by characters' actions, such as dust and debris during attacks, as you can see here, as well as splash and ripple effects when interacting with water surfaces. Particle effects generated by special attacks don't seem to be affected. In terms of performance, there is roughly a 4% drop when using standard compared to low. So unless you are seeing noticeable slowdowns during intense combat scenarios, I recommend leaving this set to standard. Let's move on to screen space reflections. This one mainly controls reflection coverage and how much of the scene is represented in SSR. And starting from standard, more objects become visible in reflections on wet surfaces. But similar to ambient occlusion, this setting comes with a side effect. Because the higher options reflect more of the scene, standard and above can introduce increased flickering and noise on reflective surfaces, as you can see here. Performance-wise, this setting doesn't seem to have a major impact. So for this one, I recommend using low to reduce the amount of noise on wet and water surfaces. Next, we have terrain. This one controls the quality of the parallax mapping applied to ground surfaces, which affects how detailed and bumpy the terrain looks, as well as the distance at which the effect is visible. In terms of performance, there is roughly a 2% drop when going from very low to standard, and around 6% drop when moving up to high and ultra. So for this one, I recommend standard. Moving on to grass density. This one is self-explanatory and adjusts how much grass is rendered across the environment, as you can see here. And the performance impact of this setting can vary depending on the scene. In this example, there is roughly a 2% drop when moving from very low to low, 5% to standard, and around 7% when going up to high. But in areas with heavier foliage, the cost increases noticeably. Here, performance drops by about 4% from very low to low, 8% to standard, and roughly 12% when switching to high. So for this one, I recommend leaving grass density on low. Let's move on to volumetric cloud quality. This setting mainly controls the game's volumetric effects, including volumetric lighting and fog. Very low disables these effects entirely, while low and higher enable them and gradually increase their definition and detail. Performance-wise, this setting doesn't have a major impact, around a 4% drop when moving from very low to high. But there might be certain areas where the higher options can cause heavier performance drops. Because of that, I recommend leaving this set to low if you like the fog effect. Cutscene quality, as the name suggests, affects the visual quality during cutscenes, as you can see here. Dropping it to low can help maintain the target frame rate during these sequences, but overall I recommend leaving it at standard for better visual consistency. Next, we have the most crucial setting in this game, global illumination. On very low, most indirect lighting is removed and replaced with a basic sky-tinted ambient fallback that introduces a dark blue glow across shaded surfaces. Moving up to low restores the game's indirect lighting, while higher options improves its accuracy, adding more depth and surface detail to indirectly lit materials. Additional visual improvements can be seen at very high and even more so at ultra, which looks significantly more stable and exhibits noticeably less flickering compared to the lower options. Global illumination also affects specular lighting. On very low, color information is removed from screen space reflections and their fallback, leading to dark blue tinted reflective surfaces. Performance-wise, this is by far the most demanding setting in the game. There is roughly a 10% cost from very low to low, 12% to very high, and a whopping 21% hit at ultra. This setting is also extremely heavy on VRAM. At 1440p with 60% resolution scale, even the low option can cause VRAM-related stuttering on the 3060 Ti. And even at 1080p with upscaling, running low global illumination feels like flying too close to the sun. Because of that, if you are using an 8GB GPU, I recommend keeping global illumination set to very low. If you have more VRAM and GPU headroom to spare, very high is the sweet spot. So given everything we've discussed so far, these are my recommended settings for Nioh 3. Let's compare the optimized settings against the Ultra preset at 1440p using DLSS preset K with a 65% resolution scale. And I have also included a locked 60 FPS at 60Hz to the comparison, since as discussed earlier, this is the best way to play the game if you can't reliably reach 120 FPS. Visually, the biggest compromise with the optimized settings on the RTX 3060 Ti is global illumination. Lighting quality takes a noticeable hit because we are using very low. But in a hardcore action game like this, I'd always prioritize rock-solid consistent performance over higher quality indirect lighting. In terms of performance, the optimized settings deliver an average uplift of around 37% compared to the Ultra preset. VRAM limitations might be contributing to this performance gap, so let's switch to the 4070 Super where VRAM isn't an issue, this time using DLSS with 85% resolution scale. We still see around a 33% performance increase with the optimized settings, slightly lower than before, but still a substantial gain. Before ending the video, I want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon. If you are able and would like to directly support my work, consider becoming a patron to get access to the highest possible quality of my latest videos, including this one. And a big thank you to all my supporters, and thanks to you as well for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and if not, leave a dislike. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.